Claire had always been the life of the party. Her laughter echoed through crowded rooms, a magnet for attention. Mark, her husband of 6 years, was drawn to her energy like a moth to a flame. He adored her spontaneity, the way she turned mundane moments into adventures. But lately, Claire's spark seemed to shine brighter outside their home than within it. Mark worked long hours as an accountant for a demanding firm. His days were spent buried in numbers and deadlines, leaving him little time or energy for the vibrant whirlwind Claire had always been. He noticed her growing restlessness, but dismissed it as part of her social nature. She was a free spirit, after all, one of the reasons he'd fallen for her. Claire, however, was beginning to resent the quiet stability Mark offered. She craved excitement, the kind of unpredictability that made her heart race. And she found it in an unlikely place, behind the wheel of a taxi. It started innocently enough. Claire often called for rides when Mark was tied up at work, or when she didn't feel like driving herself. She struck up casual conversations with the drivers, enjoying the fleeting connection with strangers. But one driver stood out, a charming, smooth-talking man named Ryan. His deep voice carried an easy confidence, and his witty banter kept her entertained during the otherwise tedious rides. Ryan was in his early 30s, with a rugged charm that Claire found irresistible. He had a sharp wit and an uncanny ability to make her feel like the most important person in the world, even if only for a 15-minute ride. Over time, Claire began requesting rides exclusively with Ryan. She justified it as harmless. After all, she needed transportation, and Ryan happened to be her favorite driver. But their conversations grew longer, more personal. Claire opened up about her frustrations with Mark, painting him as a dull, inattentive husband. Ryan listened intently, offering sympathy and validation. He shared stories of his own, how he'd ended up driving taxis after a failed business venture, how he dreamed of something bigger. Their bond deepened with every ride. It wasn't long before Ryan began parking outside Claire's favorite cafe during his downtime, hoping to catch her for a quick coffee or a chat. Claire, flattered by the attention, started inviting him inside. They laughed over lattes, their knees brushing under the small table. Claire told herself it was innocent, just a bit of fun to break up the monotony of her day. But deep down, she knew there was more to it. One evening, after yet another late night at work for Mark, Claire impulsively texted Ryan. She'd had a few glasses of wine and was feeling lonely. Ryan responded immediately, offering to pick her up for a drive. The city lights blurred as they cruised through the streets, Claire's laughter filling the car. When Ryan pulled over by a quiet park, their playful banter turned into something more charged. Claire leaned in first, her lips brushing his in a tentative kiss that quickly deepened into something much bolder. The next morning, Claire told herself it had been a mistake, a moment of weakness. But the thrill of it lingered, pulling her back to Ryan again and again. Their encounters became more frequent, their connection more intense. She began dressing up for her rides with him, her heart racing every time she slid into the passenger seat. Mark, oblivious to the affair, continued to work tirelessly, believing he was providing the life Claire deserved. He didn't notice her growing detachment or the way she spent more time on her phone. Claire grew bolder, concocting lies about shopping trips and social events to cover her time with Ryan. She relished the thrill of deception, the sense of power it gave her. But Ryan, for all his charm, wasn't without flaws. He was impulsive and reckless, prone to risky behavior that only heightened Claire's adrenaline. Their affair teetered on the edge of chaos, threatening to explode at any moment. And explode it would, but not yet. For now, Claire was living in a bubble of passion and deceit, convinced she could keep her secret forever. She didn't realize that every lie, every stolen moment, was another thread unraveling the fabric of her marriage. The affair had become Claire's addiction. Each rendezvous with Ryan was like a hit of adrenaline she couldn't resist. She knew she was playing with fire, but the danger only made it more intoxicating. Mark remained blissfully unaware, buried in spreadsheets and deadlines, trusting his wife without question. Claire, emboldened by his obliviousness, allowed herself to take greater risks. Ryan, too, was getting more comfortable. He'd started calling Claire late at night, his voice thick with desire. Sometimes, he'd show up unannounced outside her favorite boutiques or coffee shops, claiming he just happened to be in the area. Claire found his persistence thrilling, a stark contrast to Mark's predictable routines. She began spending entire afternoons with Ryan, under the guise of shopping or meeting friends. One particularly daring afternoon, Claire told Mark she was meeting an old college friend for lunch. In reality, she had planned a drive with Ryan to a secluded spot just outside the city. The narrow dirt road wound through a dense forest, leading to a clearing with a breathtaking view of the river. They parked the car and stepped out, the autumn air crisp and invigorating. Claire leaned against the hood of the car, her laughter ringing out as Ryan recounted a particularly absurd story from his days as a bartender. When he stepped closer, his hand brushing hers, she didn't pull away. Their kisses grew heated, and before long, they were tangled together in the back seat of his car, the windows fogging up as they gave in to their passion. Claire felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. When it was over, she adjusted her clothes and reapplied her lipstick, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Ryan lit a cigarette, his smirk lazy and satisfied. "You're something else, Claire," he said, his voice low and rough. She smiled back, a glint of mischief in her eyes. Mark's life had settled into a rhythm he found comforting, though others might have called it monotonous. He'd leave for work before dawn, spend the day in meetings and crunching numbers, and return home to a quiet dinner with Claire. Her apparent happiness, or what he thought was happiness, gave him peace of mind. He believed they were in a good place. Despite the occasional flicker of doubt, he quickly brushed aside. "She's just busy," he'd tell himself when Claire came home late or seemed distracted. "She's always had a lot going on." He had no reason to suspect otherwise. Claire had mastered the art of lying, weaving stories so convincingly that Mark never thought to question her. "How was lunch?" he asked one evening as they sat down to dinner. "Wonderful," Claire replied, her smile dazzling. "We spent hours catching up. You wouldn't believe how much she's accomplished." She launched into an elaborate tale about her friend's new business venture, her voice animated and her gestures expressive. Mark listened, his expression softening with affection. The lies started to pile up. Claire found herself juggling her stories, making mental notes to ensure consistency. She began deleting messages and call logs, erasing every trace of Ryan from her phone. But Ryan, reckless and impulsive, didn't share her caution. He started leaving little marks of their time together, a lipstick-stained coffee cup in his car, a scarf forgotten on the back seat. One evening, as Claire and Mark prepared for bed, she realized she'd left an earring in Ryan's car. Her stomach dropped, but she quickly composed herself. "Everything okay?" Mark asked, noticing her hesitation. "Yes, just remembered I need to call Jen tomorrow about lunch next week," Claire lied smoothly. Mark nodded, already half asleep. Claire, however, lay awake, her mind racing. She texted Ryan first thing in the morning, demanding he return the earring immediately. Ryan's reply was flippant. "Relax, babe. No one's going to notice." But Claire wasn't convinced. She insisted on meeting him before Mark got home from work. Ryan obliged, but his annoyance was clear. "You're getting paranoid," he said as he handed her the earring. "Maybe this is too much for you." Claire's eyes flashed. "Too much for me? You have no idea what I'm handling. Just don't screw this up." Ryan raised his hands in mock surrender, a grin tugging at his lips. Despite her careful planning, Claire's double life began to take its toll. She became irritable and short-tempered, snapping at Mark over trivial matters. When he suggested they take a weekend trip to reconnect, she balked. "I can't just drop everything," she said, her tone sharp. "I have plans, Mark. Do you ever think about my schedule?" Mark, hurt but unwilling to escalate the argument, backed off. "Maybe next month," then he offered quietly. Claire muttered something non-committal and left the room, her guilt momentarily breaking through her defenses. But it wasn't enough to make her stop. If anything, it pushed her further into Ryan's arms. The thrill of the affair had become her escape, a way to avoid confronting the cracks in her marriage. She told herself she deserved this, that Mark's neglect had driven her to it. But deep down, she knew she was lying to herself as much as to him. The stage was set for disaster, and the first threads of Claire's carefully constructed web were beginning to fray. She just didn't see it yet. Mark's life of quiet contentment began to crack when a seemingly insignificant moment planted the first seed of doubt. It was a rainy Wednesday evening, and Mark arrived home earlier than usual. As he stepped into their shared apartment, he noticed Claire's phone buzzing incessantly on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up repeatedly with the same name, Ryan. Mark hesitated, his hand hovering over the phone. He knew better than to invade Claire's privacy, but something about the frequency of the calls made him uneasy. He called out to her, but she didn't respond. Moments later, she emerged from the bathroom, towel-wrapped and startled to see him. "You're home early," she said, her voice tinged with surprise. Her eyes flicked to the phone as she quickly grabbed it, silencing the call. "Long day. Thought I'd call it quits early," Mark replied, watching her carefully. "Who's Ryan?" Claire's face didn't betray a flicker of panic. She had become an expert at lying. "Oh, just a friend from my yoga class. He's been helping me with some stretches." She smiled sweetly, slipping the phone into her pocket. "You'd like him. He's super chill." Mark nodded, though a faint unease lingered. Claire's explanation seemed plausible, but something about the way she clutched her phone felt off. He pushed the thought aside, telling himself not to overthink it. The close call with Mark only fueled Claire's recklessness. She convinced herself that she could outsmart him, that her lies were airtight. Ryan, meanwhile, was growing bolder, texting her at all hours and urging her to take bigger risks. Claire found herself caught between exhilaration and anxiety, torn between the thrill of the affair and the fear of being caught. One afternoon, Ryan suggested they take a short road trip to a nearby beach town. "Just for the day," he said. "You need a break, Claire. Something to clear your head." Claire hesitated. It was one thing to sneak around the city, but leaving town felt riskier. Still, the idea of escaping with Ryan was too tempting to resist. She told Mark she was going on a shopping trip with a friend and wouldn't be back until late. Mark barely looked up from his laptop, offering her a distracted, "Have fun." The drive to the beach was exhilarating. With the windows down and the salty breeze in her hair, Claire felt freer than she had in years. Ryan reached over and rested a hand on her thigh, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. By the time they arrived, Claire had pushed all thoughts of Mark from her mind. They spent the day walking along the shoreline, stealing kisses in hidden corners, and drinking cocktails at a beachfront bar. When the sun began to set, Ryan pulled her close, whispering promises of more days like this. Claire, tipsy and intoxicated by his attention, believed him. Back at home, Mark began piecing together the subtle changes in Claire's behavior. She had become more secretive, guarding her phone like a hawk and brushing off his questions with curt responses. She'd started wearing new outfits, ones that felt more suited to a date than a casual outing. And then there were the frequent absences, lunches that stretched into dinners, errands that took hours longer than they should. One evening, while Claire was out, Mark decided to tidy up the apartment. As he gathered laundry from their bedroom, he noticed a receipt sticking out of Claire's handbag. It was from a restaurant in the beach town she had supposedly visited with a friend. But what caught Mark's attention was the date and time. A weekday afternoon when Claire had claimed to be running errands in the city. His heart sank as a wave of doubt washed over him. He tried to dismiss it, to convince himself there was an innocent explanation. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind. Claire returned home late that night, her cheeks flushed and her hair tousled. Mark watched her carefully, his mind racing. "How was your day?" he asked, his tone measured. "Busy," Claire replied, kicking off her heels. "I didn't even have time for lunch." Mark's jaw tightened. "That's funny. I found a receipt for lunch today, at a place outside the city." Claire froze for a split second before recovering. "Oh, that? I stopped by there with Jen on the way back from an appointment. Totally forgot to mention it." She laughed, brushing past him. "You're so detail-oriented, Mark. You should be a detective." Mark forced a smile, but his suspicions deepened. He decided then and there that he needed answers. The woman he thought he knew was hiding something, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. The tension between them grew palpable, each lie pushing their relationship closer to the breaking point. Claire, oblivious to Mark's growing doubts, continued her dangerous game. But Mark was no longer the trusting husband she believed him to be. He was watching, waiting, and preparing to uncover the truth. Mark couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Claire's dismissive attitude and increasingly erratic behavior were glaring red flags he could no longer ignore. Determined to find the truth, he began paying closer attention to the little things. The gaps in her stories, the frequent yoga classes, and the way her phone never left her side. One evening, while Claire was in the shower, Mark seized the opportunity to glance at her phone. His hands trembled as he unlocked it, his heart pounding with a mix of guilt and determination. The messages were damning. Ryan's name appeared repeatedly, with texts that left little room for interpretation. "Can't stop thinking about today. You looked incredible. When can I see you again? I miss you already." Mark's stomach churned as he scrolled further, each message confirming what he had feared. Photos, locations, and flirtatious exchanges painted a clear picture of betrayal. His face burned with humiliation and anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. He needed more than just texts. He needed undeniable proof. Mark decided to bide his time, knowing a confrontation without concrete evidence might backfire. He started tracking Claire's movements subtly, noting the times she claimed to be at yoga or with friends. When she announced a last-minute weekend retreat with her yoga group, Mark saw his chance. He hired a private investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Linda who specialized in infidelity cases. Linda was thorough and discreet, ensuring that Claire wouldn't suspect a thing. Together, they devised a plan to follow her over the weekend. Claire left early Saturday morning, her gym bag slung over her shoulder. She kissed Mark on the cheek, her smile wide and carefree. "Don't work too hard while I'm gone," she said before heading out the door. Mark watched her go, his jaw clenched. He waited until she was out of sight before calling Linda, who was already in position to tail her. Hours passed as Mark sat at home, the silence of the apartment almost unbearable. His phone buzzed late in the afternoon, a message from Linda. "She's not at any yoga retreat. She's with him." The evidence Linda provided was irrefutable. Photos of Claire and Ryan together, their body language intimate and unmistakable. They were at a secluded park, laughing and holding hands. Later, they shared a meal at a small cafe, their faces glowing with the unmistakable joy of infatuation. The final nail in the coffin came when Linda captured images of the two slipping into Ryan's car, their intentions clear. Mark stared at the photos, his hands trembling. The betrayal cut deeper than he had imagined. The woman he'd loved and trusted had been leading a double life right under his nose. He felt a surge of anger, but also a strange sense of relief. Now he had the truth. Claire returned home Sunday evening, her demeanor relaxed and cheerful. "It was such a rejuvenating weekend," she said, setting her bag down. "How was yours?" Mark's response was cold and measured. "Fine. Did you have fun with Ryan?" Claire froze, her smile faltering. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice defensive. Mark tossed the photos onto the table. "Don't lie to me, Claire. I know everything." Her eyes widened as she stared at the evidence. For a moment, she was silent, her mind racing. Then she erupted. "How dare you spy on me?" she shouted. "This is an invasion of my privacy." Mark's voice remained steady. "Don't turn this around on me. You've been lying to me for months. I deserve the truth." Claire's expression hardened. "Fine, you want the truth?" "Yes, I've been seeing Ryan. And you know why? Because he pays attention to me. He makes me feel alive, something you stopped doing a long time ago." Mark felt a wave of anger, but refused to be drawn into her deflection. "Don't blame me for your choices. You could have talked to me, but instead, you chose to betray me." The argument stretched into the night, Claire alternating between defensive anger and tearful apologies. Mark, however, had already made up his mind. By the time morning came, he had packed a suitcase and contacted a divorce lawyer. Claire begged him to reconsider, her hysteria growing as the reality of her actions set in. But Mark remained resolute. "You made your choice, Claire. Now I'm making mine." As he closed the door behind him, Mark felt a mix of sorrow and liberation. The life he'd known was over, but a new chapter was beginning. He didn't know what the future held, but he was determined to face it with integrity and strength. Claire, left alone in the apartment, was consumed by a whirlwind of emotions: anger, regret, and the bitter sting of consequences. She had played her game, and she had lost, but the story was far from over. The fallout from their fractured marriage would bring twists neither of them could predict. The silence in the apartment was deafening after Mark left. Claire sat on the couch, her face buried in her hands. She couldn't believe what had just happened. For all her bravado, she hadn't expected Mark to actually leave. He had always been the steady, predictable one, the husband who forgave, the man who bent over backward to keep the peace. But this time he had walked out. Claire's phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was Ryan. "Hey, everything okay?" His text read. She hesitated before typing back, "No." Mark found out. The reply came quickly. "Do you want to come over?" For a moment, Claire considered it. Ryan had been her escape, her thrill, the one who made her feel desired again. But now, as she stared at his message, doubt crept in. Was he worth it? Was this affair worth the destruction it had caused? Mark drove aimlessly through the city, his mind racing. He had always thought of himself as a rational man, someone who could handle life's challenges with grace. But this betrayal, had thrown him into uncharted territory. He pulled into a quiet park and sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel as waves of anger and sadness crashed over him. His phone rang. It was Linda, the private investigator. "Mark, I know this is a difficult time," she said, her voice gentle. "But if you need help navigating what comes next, financial arrangements, documentation for the divorce, I can refer you to someone." Mark sighed. "Thanks, Linda. I'll let you know. For now, I just need to think." Hanging up, he made a decision. He wasn't going to let Claire's actions define him. He would move forward, even if it hurt. Claire showed up at Ryan's place later that night. He opened the door with a grin, pulling her into a kiss. But as she stepped inside, the excitement she once felt around him was gone. The apartment, with its mismatched furniture and cluttered surfaces, suddenly seemed less charming and more transient. This wasn't the life she wanted. "Tell me what happened," Ryan said, handing her a glass of wine. Claire launched into the story, painting herself as the victim. "Mark has been so distant, so cold," she said, tears streaming down her face. "And when he found out about us, he just left. No discussion, no chance to explain." Ryan nodded sympathetically, but his expression shifted when Claire started talking about the photos. "Wait, he hired someone to follow you?" "Yes," Claire exclaimed. "Can you believe that? It's like he's been spying on me." Ryan's unease was palpable. He had never intended for things to get this complicated. The thrill of sneaking around was one thing, but now it felt messy, too real. "Maybe you should give it some time," he said. "Figure out what you really want." Claire's eyes narrowed. "What I want? I thought we were on the same page, Ryan. Or was this just a game to you?" Ryan held up his hands defensively. "Claire, I like you, but this is a lot. Maybe we should slow down." The next day, Mark met with a divorce lawyer. As he sat in the sleek office, the weight of his decision settled over him. The lawyer, a sharp and efficient woman named Angela, laid out his options. "With no children and both of you working, this should be relatively straightforward," she said. "But we'll need to document everything: shared assets, finances, any evidence of infidelity." Mark nodded. "I've got the evidence. Photos, texts, everything." Angela raised an eyebrow. "Good. That will help. We'll aim for a clean break, but be prepared for resistance. Affairs like this can bring out the worst in people." Mark left the office feeling a strange mix of dread and relief. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was taking control of his life. Claire returned home the next day to find Mark's belongings gone. The closet was half empty, his favorite mug missing from the kitchen shelf. Reality hit her like a freight train. She had always assumed she could charm her way out of any situation, but Mark's absence was undeniable proof that she had pushed too far. She called him, her voice trembling. "Mark, can we please talk? I made a mistake, but we can work through this." "I know we can. His response was calm, but firm. Claire, it's over. I've already contacted a lawyer. You'll hear from them soon. Claire's anger flared. So that's it? You're just walking away? After everything we've been through? You made your choice, Claire, Mark replied. Now I'm making mine. As the line went dead, Claire threw her phone across the room, the screen shattering on impact. For the first time, she felt the full weight of her actions. But instead of taking responsibility, she let her bitterness fester, vowing to make Mark's life as difficult as possible. The fallout from their shattered marriage was just beginning. Mark was determined to rebuild his life, while Claire, unable to let go of her pride, was prepared to fight tooth and nail. The path ahead would be filled with unexpected twists, revealing just how far each of them was willing to go in the aftermath of betrayal. The days following Mark's departure were a whirlwind of emotions for both him and Claire. While Mark focused on building a new chapter of his life, Claire found herself spiraling into a mix of anger and desperation. Her attempts to reach out to Mark were met with silence or curt responses. Every unanswered call, an ignored message, only fueled her resentment. One evening, Claire decided to take matters into her own hands. She showed up at Mark's temporary apartment unannounced, her demeanor oscillating between pleading and confrontational. When Mark opened the door, her appearance startled him. Her makeup was smudged, and her eyes were red from crying. "We need to talk," she said, pushing past him into the apartment. Mark sighed, closing the door behind her. "Claire, this isn't the time. You can't just walk away from me like this," she snapped. "We're married, Mark. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "It did," Mark replied, his voice calm but firm. "Until you betrayed me." Her expression hardened. "Betrayed you? Don't act like you were perfect. You neglected me for years, Mark. I had to find comfort somewhere." Mark's patience wore thin. "Stop blaming me for your choices, Claire. You could have talked to me, but you chose to lie and cheat instead." Claire's voice rose. "Because talking to you never changed anything. You were always so wrapped up in your work, your routine. You never saw me." Mark shook his head. "We're not doing this. I've moved out, I filed for divorce, and I'm not coming back. It's time for you to accept that." Meanwhile, Ryan was beginning to regret his involvement with Claire. What had started as an exciting affair was now a source of stress and complications. Claire's increasing demands for his time and attention were suffocating, and her unpredictable moods left him constantly on edge. One night, as they sat in his car after a tense dinner, Ryan decided to confront her. "Claire, I think we need to slow things down." She turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "Slow things down? What are you talking about?" "This whole situation," he said carefully. "It's a lot. And honestly, I didn't sign up for this level of drama." Claire's voice grew sharp. "Drama? You're the one who pursued me, Ryan. Don't act like you're some innocent bystander." "I'm not saying I am," he replied, trying to stay calm. "But this is getting out of hand. Your husband knows about us, and now it feels like everything is falling apart." "So what?" Claire snapped. "You're just going to bail on me now? After everything we've been through?" Ryan hesitated, his silence speaking volumes. While Claire's life unraveled, Mark was beginning to find a sense of stability. He threw himself into work, taking on new projects and using the busy schedule as a way to distract himself from the pain. He also reconnected with old friends, people he hadn't seen much of during his marriage. One evening, his friend and colleague Jake invited him to a networking event. "You need to get out there," Jake said. "Meet new people, have some fun." Reluctantly, Mark agreed. The event was held at a trendy downtown bar, and as the night went on, Mark found himself enjoying the conversations and energy around him. He even struck up a connection with a woman named Emily, who worked in marketing. She was smart, kind, and refreshingly straightforward, a stark contrast to the turmoil he'd left behind. As they exchanged numbers at the end of the night, Mark felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. Claire, on the other hand, was spiraling. With Mark gone and Ryan pulling away, she felt increasingly isolated. She started drinking more, spending her nights scrolling through old photos of her and Mark, alternating between anger and regret. One night, in a fit of desperation, she called Ryan. When he didn't answer, She left a series of increasingly frantic voicemails. "You can't ignore me, Ryan. I need you. We need to talk." The next day, Ryan finally called her back, but his tone was cold. "Claire, this isn't working. I think we should stop seeing each other." Her heart sank. "You can't be serious. After everything I gave up for you?" "I'm sorry," he said, his voice flat. "I just can't do this anymore." Claire slammed her phone down, her frustration boiling over. She had burned her marriage to the ground for Ryan, and now he was walking away too. The realization hit her hard. She was completely alone. As the weeks passed, Mark continued to rebuild his life, while Claire struggled to pick up the pieces of hers. Their paths seemed destined to diverge entirely, but the fallout from their relationship wasn't over yet. Claire's bitterness and inability to let go would lead her to make decisions that would impact them both in ways neither of them could foresee. For Mark, the future was starting to look brighter. But for Claire, the consequences of her actions were only beginning to unfold. Claire's isolation was growing unbearable. With Mark refusing to engage and Ryan gone, she found herself consumed by regret, anger, and an overwhelming need to regain control of her life. Her once confident demeanor had been replaced by paranoia, and she began obsessively tracking Mark's social media, trying to find any hint of his new life. Late one night, after too much wine, she saw a photo of Mark with Emily at a recent networking event. The caption read, "A fresh start with good company." Claire's blood boiled. It was one thing for Mark to leave her, but for him to move on so quickly felt like the ultimate betrayal. She grabbed her phone and called him. When he didn't answer, she left a voicemail laced with anger and desperation. "So, you're parading around with some new woman now? You think you could just replace me? You'll regret this, Mark. I swear you will." The next morning, Mark listened to Claire's voicemail with a mix of frustration and disbelief. He had tried to maintain a semblance of civility for the sake of closure, but her behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. He forwarded the voicemail to Angela, his divorce lawyer, with a note, "This is getting out of hand. Let me know how to proceed." Angela called him later that day. "Mark, it might be time to consider a restraining order if this continues." Her messages could be seen as harassment. Mark sighed. "I'll think about it. I just want this to be over." Feeling cornered, Claire decided to take matters into her own hands. She reached out to an old acquaintance, Jenna, who worked in private investigations. Jenna had always been a little shady, and Claire hoped she could dig up something on Emily to use against Mark. Over drinks at a dimly lit bar, Claire laid out her plan. "I need dirt on this woman he's seeing. Anything that can make him see she's not who he thinks she is." Jenna raised an eyebrow. "You sure about this, Claire? Sounds like you're playing with fire." "I don't care," Claire said, her voice trembling with determination. "He needs to know he can't just erase me from his life." Jenna agreed to take on the job, but her skepticism lingered. Mark, unaware of Claire's scheming, was enjoying his time with Emily. Their connection was easy and genuine, a stark contrast to the tension he had endured with Claire. On their third date, they went for a hike in a nearby state park. As they reached a scenic overlook, Emily turned to him with a smile. "I'm glad we met," she said. "You seem like someone who's finally ready to let go of the past." Mark nodded, though Claire's recent outbursts still lingered in the back of his mind. "I'm trying. It's not easy, but I'm getting there." Emily reached for his hand. "You deserve to be happy, Mark. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Jenna's investigation turned up nothing on Emily. Frustrated, Claire lashed out, accusing Jenna of not trying hard enough. "You're supposed to be good at this," she shouted over the phone. "Claire, there's nothing to find," Jenna replied, her patience wearing thin. "Maybe it's time to let this go." But Claire wasn't ready to let go. That night, she showed up at Emily's apartment. Standing outside the building, she debated whether to confront her. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of anger and jealousy. Finally, she marched up to the door and knocked. When Emily answered, her expression shifted from surprise to concern. "Claire, right?" Emily asked cautiously. "Can I help you?" Claire forced a smile, though her eyes burned with resentment. "We need to talk." "About Mark?" Emily hesitated, but stepped aside to let Claire in. What followed was a tense conversation, with Claire attempting to paint herself as the victim. "Mark isn't who you think he is," she said. "He's cold, distant, and he'll throw you away just like he did with me." Emily listened calmly before responding. "Claire, I'm sorry you're hurting, but Mark deserves to move on. So do you." Claire's facade cracked. "You don't know anything about us," she shouted before storming out, leaving Emily shaken. The restraining order was swiftly granted, much to Claire's outrage. She received the paperwork one rainy afternoon, standing under the awning of her apartment building. As she read through the legal jargon, her hands trembled with fury. Mark had taken their marriage, her stability, and now her dignity. It felt like a calculated effort to erase her completely. She stormed back into her apartment and hurled the documents onto the kitchen counter. Her thoughts spiraled. She couldn't let Mark win. He needed to understand the pain he had caused her, and if he wasn't willing to listen, she would find a way to make him. Aware of Claire's volatility, Mark took extra precautions. He installed security cameras around his apartment and alerted his building's management about the restraining order. Emily, though supportive, expressed concern. "I'm not scared of her," Emily said during a quiet dinner at Mark's place. "But I don't want her to hurt you. Or herself." Mark reached across the table and took her hand. "She won't. This is just her lashing out because she lost control. Once the divorce is finalized, it'll be over." Emily nodded, though unease lingered in her eyes. The restraining order only deepened Claire's obsession. She began ignoring her own work responsibilities, spending her days plotting ways to undermine Mark's happiness. Her apartment became a mess of takeout containers, empty wine bottles, and scribbled notes detailing her increasingly erratic plans. One night, fueled by a mix of alcohol and despair, Claire decided to confront Mark directly. Restraining order be damned. She drove to his apartment complex, parking a block away to avoid detection. As she sat in her car, watching the building's entrance, she saw a familiar figure step outside. It was Emily. Emily laughed at something on her phone as she waited for her ride. Claire's grip on the steering wheel tightened. In that moment, her jealousy and rage reached a fever pitch. She started her car and began to follow the rideshare vehicle as it pulled away from the curb. Emily's ride stopped at a small, cozy restaurant across town. Claire parked nearby, her heart pounding. She watched as Emily stepped out and greeted a group of friends waiting at the entrance. They hugged and chatted before disappearing inside. Claire sat in her car, her mind racing. This was her chance to confront Emily again, to make her understand the damage she had done. But as she reached for her door handle, a voice of reason cut through her anger. What was she doing? She had already violated the restraining order just by being here. She hesitated, her breath coming in ragged gasps. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of self-awareness surfaced. She was losing herself in her obsession with Mark. Was it worth it? Could she even undo the damage she had caused? Claire drove home that night without confronting Emily. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to cry, not out of anger or frustration, but out of sheer exhaustion. She sat in her darkened apartment, surrounded by the mess she had created, and realized she couldn't keep living like this. The next morning, she called Jenna. "I need help," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't do this anymore." Jenna, surprised but relieved, agreed to help Claire find a therapist and start rebuilding her life. It was a small step, but it was the first one Claire had taken toward letting go. Unaware of Claire's decision to seek help, Mark continued to move forward. He and Emily grew closer, their relationship providing a sense of stability and happiness he hadn't felt in years. The divorce was finalized a month later, marking the official end of his marriage. On the day the papers came through, Mark stood on his balcony, looking out at the city skyline. He felt a mix of relief and sadness, but mostly hope. For Mark, the finalization of the divorce marked the end of an exhausting chapter. He folded the official papers and placed them in a drawer, a symbolic act of closure. That evening, Emily suggested they celebrate. "Something simple," she said with a smile. "Dinner at that new Italian place? I hear their tiramisu is life-changing." Mark agreed, grateful for her steady presence. Over dinner, they talked about everything but Claire. Mark found himself laughing more easily, the weight of the past finally lifting. For the first time in months, he felt optimistic about the future. Claire's decision to seek help was met with skepticism from those who knew her. Jenna, who had seen Claire at her worst, cautiously supported her friend's efforts. "Therapy is a good start," Jenna said, "but you're going to have to work hard to fix this mess." Claire nodded, determined. Her therapist, Dr. Holland, was a no-nonsense woman who didn't shy away from tough conversations. In their first session, Claire broke down, recounting the affair, the divorce, and the spiral that followed. "Why do you think you've been so fixated on Mark?" Dr. Holland asked gently. Claire wiped her eyes. "Because he was my stability. Even when things were bad, I always knew he'd be there. And now he's not." Det är hållnödigt. Losing stability can feel like losing a part of yourself. But clinging to the past isn't the answer. Let's figure out what you really want for your future. Meanwhile, Mark and Emily's relationship deepened. They began spending weekends exploring the city, trying new restaurants, and even planning a short getaway to the coast. Emily's warmth and understanding were a balm to Mark's wounded heart. One evening, as they walked along the beach, Emily slipped her hand into his. "Do you ever think about what's next for us?" she asked, her tone light but curious. Mark paused, gazing out at the horizon. "I do," he admitted, "but I'm taking things one step at a time. I don't want to rush anything." Emily smiled. That's all I needed to hear. Weeks of therapy began to chip away at Claire's defenses. She confronted painful truths about her behavior and started taking responsibility for her actions. Dr. Holland encouraged her to write a letter to Mark, not to send, but as an exercise in closure. Claire poured her heart onto the page, admitting her faults and apologizing for the pain she'd caused. By the time she finished, her hands were trembling, but she felt lighter. "What do I do with it now?" she asked Dr. Holland. "That's up to you," the therapist replied. "But sometimes letting go means letting it all out and then moving forward." Claire folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer, unsure if she'd ever share it. For now, it was enough to know she'd taken the first step toward healing. One sunny afternoon, Mark and Emily were strolling through a local art fair when they unexpectedly crossed paths with Claire. She was browsing a booth of handmade jewelry, her demeanor more subdued than the fiery, erratic woman Mark had last encountered. Claire noticed them at the same moment. For a brief, tense second, their eyes met. Then, to Mark's surprise, Claire nodded politely and walked away without a word. Emily squeezed his hand. "Are you okay?" Mark exhaled slowly. "Yeah, I think she's finally letting go." Neither of them noticed Claire pause at another booth, watching them from a distance. She felt a pang of sadness, but also a sense of acceptance. For the first time, she didn't feel the urge to intervene or confront. Instead, she turned and walked in the opposite direction, ready to face whatever came next. Mark and Claire's journeys had diverged completely, yet both were finally moving toward peace. Mark embraced the possibilities of a new life with Emily, while Claire continued her path of self-discovery and healing. Though their shared history could never be erased, it no longer defined them. As the sun set on that pivotal day, both Mark and Claire found themselves standing at different crossroads. For Mark, it was a future filled with hope and love. For Claire, it was the start of a long road toward redemption. And for both, it was a reminder that even the most broken stories could lead to new beginnings. Mark felt a new rhythm settling into his life. With the divorce finalized and his relationship with Emily deepening, the wounds from his marriage were beginning to heal. Work was fulfilling again, and he had started reconnecting with hobbies he had long neglected. Emily encouraged him to pick up painting, something he had enjoyed in college but abandoned during the chaos of his marriage. One evening, as Mark worked on a canvas in his apartment, Emily watched him with a smile. "You're really good at this," she said. Mark chuckled. "It's just for fun." "Maybe, but you're talented," Emily replied. "You should consider showing your work someday." Mark shook his head, but her words stayed with him. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to dream about a future that didn't revolve around pleasing others. Claire, too, was finding her footing. Therapy remained challenging, but Dr. Holland's guidance had given her a new perspective on her life and choices. Slowly, She began rebuilding relationships with friends she had alienated during her downward spiral. Jenna remained her closest ally, encouraging Claire to focus on small victories. "Why don't you start volunteering?" Jenna suggested one afternoon. "It might help you reconnect with yourself." Claire hesitated but eventually agreed. She began working at a local animal shelter, spending her mornings cleaning kennels and walking dogs. The work was physically demanding but strangely therapeutic. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose. One day, as Claire was feeding a litter of puppies, the shelter manager approached her. "You're a natural with the animals," she said. "Have you ever thought about fostering?" The idea intrigued Claire. She had spent so long focused on herself that the thought of caring for something else felt like a step forward. While Claire and Mark were moving on in their own ways, their paths briefly intersected again when a financial matter required them to meet. It was a mundane issue involving the sale of a jointly owned piece of furniture, but the interaction held a weight neither could ignore. They met at a neutral location, a coffee shop they had frequented during their marriage. The atmosphere was charged with unspoken tension as they exchanged paperwork. Mark noticed how different Claire looked, calmer, more composed. Claire, in turn, noted the ease in Mark's demeanor, a stark contrast to the stressed man she remembered. "How's Emily?" Claire asked, breaking the silence. Mark hesitated, but decided to answer honestly. "She's great. She's been really supportive." Claire nodded, her expression unreadable. "That's good. I'm glad you've found someone who makes you happy." "And you?" Mark asked cautiously. "I'm getting there," Claire admitted. "Therapy's been helping. I've got a lot to work on, but I'm trying." The conversation ended on a surprisingly cordial note, leaving both with a sense of closure they hadn't realized they needed. As the months passed, Mark and Emily's relationship flourished. They moved in together, blending their lives in a way that felt natural and effortless. Emily's encouragement continued to push Mark toward embracing new opportunities. He submitted a painting to a local gallery's open call and was thrilled when it was accepted. The opening night of the gallery exhibit was a milestone for Mark. Surrounded by friends and supporters, he felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond the art itself. Emily stood by his side, her pride evident. "This is just the beginning," she whispered to him as they toasted with glasses of champagne. Mark smiled, knowing she was right. As the months passed, Mark and Emily's relationship flourished. They moved in together, blending their lives in a way that felt natural and effortless. Emily's encouragement continued to push Mark toward embracing new opportunities. He submitted a painting to a local gallery's open call and was thrilled when it was accepted. The opening night of the gallery exhibit was a milestone for Mark. Surrounded by friends and supporters, he felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond the art itself. Emily stood by his side, her pride evident. "This is just the beginning," she whispered to him as they toasted with glasses of champagne. Mark smiled, knowing she was right. Mark and Claire's lives continued to unfold along separate paths, each finding fulfillment in ways they hadn't imagined. While their shared history remained a part of them, it no longer defined who they were. For Mark, it was a life of creativity and love, built with Emily by his side. For Claire, it was a journey of redemption and purpose, fueled by her dedication to helping others, both human and animal. In their own ways, they had both found peace. And though they rarely thought of each other anymore, their individual stories stood as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the possibility of new beginnings. Months passed, and the separate lives of Mark and Claire continued to evolve. While they had found peace in their individual journeys, fate had a way of intertwining paths that once seemed fully severed. One sunny Saturday afternoon, Mark and Emily attended a local community event organized by the animal shelter where Claire volunteered. Emily had recently expressed an interest in adopting a dog, and Mark thought the event would be a perfect outing. The bustling park was alive with music, booths, and wagging tails. As Mark and Emily strolled through the event, they stopped at a booth showcasing animals up for adoption. To Mark's surprise, Claire was there, standing beside a timid dog with soft brown eyes. Claire's gaze met Mark's, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. "Claire, Mark said, his voice tinged with surprise. Mark, Claire replied, her tone equally startled. Her eyes shifted to Emily and then back to Mark. It's good to see you. Emily, ever gracious, extended her hand. Emily. It's nice to meet you. Claire hesitated but shook Emily's hand. I'm Claire. I work here at the shelter. She gestured toward the dog at her side. This is Daisy. She's one of our rescues. Emily crouched down, extending a hand toward Daisy. The dog sniffed cautiously before wagging her tail. She's beautiful, Emily said. We're actually thinking of adopting. Maybe Daisy would be a good fit. Claire's expression softened. She's a sweetheart. A little shy at first, but once she warms up to you, she's incredibly loyal. Mark watched the exchange, a mix of emotions swirling within him. The encounter was unexpected, but he couldn't deny the sense of closure it brought. Claire seemed genuinely invested in her work, and for the first time, he saw her in a new light, not as the woman who had betrayed him, but as someone trying to rebuild her life. After Emily filled out the initial paperwork to start the adoption process, she excused herself to explore more of the event, leaving Mark and Claire alone. The awkward silence between them was broken when Claire spoke. You've done well for yourself, she said, her voice sincere. Emily seems like a wonderful person. She is, Mark replied. And it looks like you found something meaningful too. Daisy seems like a great dog. Claire smiled faintly. She's been my rock. Taking care of her has taught me a lot about patience and forgiveness. She hesitated before continuing. I've wanted to say this for a while, Mark. I'm sorry for everything. The lies, the betrayal. I know I can't undo the past, but I hope you know I've been trying to change. Mark studied her face, searching for any hint of insincerity, but found none. Thank you, Claire. That means a lot. And for what it's worth, I'm glad you're doing better. We've both come a long way. Later that evening, as Mark and Emily settled in at home, Daisy curled up on the floor beside them. Emily couldn't stop smiling. She's perfect, she said, running her fingers through Daisy's fur. Mark leaned back on the couch, watching the peaceful scene. The day's events had been unexpected, but they left him feeling more certain than ever about the direction his life was taking. For all the pain and chaos of the past, it had brought him to this moment, a place of contentment and possibility. For Claire, the encounter with Mark and Emily was a turning point. It reaffirmed her commitment to her own growth and to letting go of the past. She threw herself even deeper into her work at the shelter, eventually taking on a leadership role to organize events and outreach programs. One evening, after a successful adoption drive, Claire sat in her quiet apartment with Daisy by her side. She thought about the long road she had traveled to get here and felt a sense of pride she hadn't known in years. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, that uncertainty felt like an opportunity rather than a burden. Mark and Claire's lives continued to unfold, occasionally brushing against one another, but always moving forward. They had become different people, shaped by their shared past, but no longer defined by it. And as they each embraced their separate futures, they carried with them the lessons they had learned along the way. For Mark, it was a life filled with love, creativity, and the quiet joy of a family, complete with Daisy as their loyal companion. For Claire, it was a journey of redemption and purpose, driven by her work and her commitment to helping others. Their stories, though intertwined, had found their own endings, not with dramatic resolutions, but with quiet, meaningful progress. And in those endings, there was peace. Mark's art began to gain traction in local galleries, his confidence growing with each successful show. With Emily's unwavering support, he decided to host his first solo exhibition. The event was held at a modern gallery downtown, and the turnout exceeded his expectations. Old friends, colleagues, and new admirers filled the space, offering praise and encouragement. Standing beside Emily at the center of the gallery, Mark realized how much he had rebuilt his life. She had been his anchor, a steady presence that reminded him of the possibilities that lay beyond pain. As they toasted with champagne, Emily leaned in and whispered, "This is only the beginning, Mark." For the first time, Mark felt he could truly believe it. At the animal shelter, Claire's leadership transformed the organization's outreach efforts. Under her guidance, the shelter held more events, raised substantial funds, and found homes for a record number of animals. Her colleagues noticed her dedication and often commented on her ability to inspire others. One day, the shelter director approached Claire with an unexpected proposal. "We're expanding," she said, handing Claire a brochure. "A new shelter in the neighboring city needs a director. I think you'd be perfect for the job." Claire was stunned. The position represented a significant step forward, both professionally and personally. "I'll need to think about it," she said, though her heart was already leaning toward acceptance. That evening, as she walked Daisy through the quiet streets of her neighborhood, Claire thought about how far she had come. The opportunity felt like a chance to start anew, not just for herself, but for the animals she had grown to love. Months later, at a charity gala hosted by the shelter, Claire and Mark's paths crossed once more. Mark had been invited as a guest artist to auction off one of his paintings, while Claire was recognized for her contributions to animal welfare. Their encounter was warm and unforced. Over the years, the edges of their shared history had softened, leaving room for mutual respect. "I hear you've been doing amazing work," Mark said, genuinely impressed. "And I've seen your art everywhere," Claire replied with a smile. "It's inspiring to see you thriving." They shared a laugh, the kind that spoke of two people who had made peace with the past. When the night ended, they parted ways with a sense of closure that was unspoken but deeply felt. Mark and Emily celebrated their first anniversary with a quiet evening at home, their lives entwined in a way that felt effortless. Daisy, now fully settled into her new home, snoozed contentedly at their feet. Over dinner, they reminisced about how far they had come as individuals and as a couple. "I never thought I'd feel this whole again," Mark admitted, taking Emily's hand. "You deserve it," she said simply. "We both do." Claire accepted the director position and moved to the neighboring city, where she threw herself into the challenge of building a new shelter from the ground up. The work was demanding, but it filled her days with purpose and joy. Daisy remained her constant companion, a reminder of the healing power of unconditional love. On her first day at the new shelter, Claire stood outside the freshly painted building, the sign gleaming in the morning sun. She felt a surge of pride and hope. This was her new beginning, and she was ready to embrace it. Mark and Claire's lives, once intertwined by love and shattered by betrayal, had found new directions. Though their paths occasionally intersected, they no longer dwelled on what had been. Instead, they carried forward the lessons they had learned, building futures that reflected their resilience and capacity for growth. In the quiet moments, both could look back and see their shared history not as a series of mistakes, but as the foundation for the lives they now led. And in those reflections, there was peace and gratitude for the pain that had forged them and the hope that had carried them forward. Life for both Mark and Claire continued to flourish, though in vastly different ways. Their separate paths carried them further from the shadows of their past. Yet the lessons they had learned remained deeply embedded in who they were becoming. Mark's art career took a surprising turn when one of his paintings caught the eye of a well-known critic at a gallery opening. The glowing review catapulted his work into a broader spotlight, leading to invitations to exhibit in larger cities. Emily was his biggest cheerleader, helping him navigate the demands of newfound success. "Do you ever miss the quiet life?" Emily asked one evening as they packed for a trip to showcase his work in Chicago. "Sometimes," Mark admitted, "but I wouldn't trade this for anything. It's more than I ever imagined." Their travels became a shared adventure, each city bringing new experiences and challenges. Daisy often accompanied them, becoming something of a mascot for their growing circle of friends and admirers. In her new role as director of the shelter, Claire found herself at the center of a thriving community. She spearheaded innovative programs, including a partnership with local schools to educate children about animal care and empathy. Her work earned her recognition from local government officials, and she was invited to speak at various community events. During one such event, Claire shared her personal story. "There was a time when I felt completely lost," she said to the attentive audience. "But working with animals taught me about unconditional love and the importance of second chances. If they can heal, so can we." The applause was thunderous, and Claire felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had turned her pain into purpose, and it showed. Years later, Mark and Emily were attending a National Animal Welfare Gala in New York City. Emily had been invited as a donor, and Mark accompanied her, curious to learn more about her passion for animal advocacy. The room buzzed with energy, filled with advocates, volunteers, and philanthropists. As they made their way to their table, Mark froze. Across the room, he saw Claire, engaged in conversation with a group of attendees. She was poised and confident, a far cry from the person she had been during their final days together. Emily noticed his reaction. "Do you want to say hello?" she asked gently. Mark hesitated before nodding. "It's been a long time." They approached, and Claire's face lit up with surprise when she saw them. "Mark, Emily, what are you doing here?" "We're here to support the cause," Emily said warmly. "It's wonderful to see you again." Claire smiled. "Likewise. I've been working with the gala organizers to expand outreach programs. It's been an amazing experience." The conversation flowed naturally, with none of the tension that had once defined their interactions. They talked about their work, their travels, and their shared admiration for the event's mission. By the end of the evening, they parted with genuine smiles and promises to stay in touch. A few weeks after the gala, Claire sent Mark a note. It was brief but heartfelt. "Mark, seeing you at the gala reminded me of how far we've both come. I'm proud of the lives we've built and the people we've become. Thank you for being a part of my story, even if it didn't turn out the way we once imagined. Wishing you all the best, Claire." Mark read the note with a sense of peace. He didn't feel the need to reply. The message wasn't about rekindling anything, but about acknowledging the journey they had shared. As the years rolled on, Mark and Emily continued to build a life filled with creativity, love, and adventure. Emily's passion for animal welfare deepened, leading her to establish her own nonprofit organization, which Mark supported wholeheartedly. Claire's shelter grew into one of the most respected in the region. She became a mentor to others in the field, her story inspiring countless people to embrace the power of second chances. Though their lives rarely intersected after the gala, Mark and Claire remained quietly aware of each other's successes. They had become symbols of resilience and growth, proof that even the most fractured relationships could yield something meaningful in the end. One crisp autumn day, Mark sat on the porch of his home with Emily and Daisy. A copy of an art magazine lay on the table, featuring one of his latest works on the cover. Nearby, Emily reviewed plans for an upcoming fundraiser for her nonprofit. Across the state, Claire walked through the shelter, greeting staff and animals alike. Daisy's photograph hung on the wall, a tribute to the dog who had been her companion through her transformation. Both paused in their respective moments, reflecting on the unexpected turns their lives had taken. Though their journeys had diverged long ago, the lessons they had learned from one another continued to guide them. In those moments, there was gratitude for the pain that had forged them, the growth that had defined them, and the futures they had embraced. Time moved steadily forward, carrying Mark and Claire into new chapters of their lives. Though their paths had long since diverged, the echoes of their shared history continued to influence them, not as wounds but as threads of resilience woven into their personal stories. Mark's art continued to flourish, evolving with each new project. His work became renowned not just for its technical brilliance, but for its emotional depth. Critics often remarked on the way his paintings seemed to capture the complexity of healing, a theme he subtly attributed to his own experiences. One of his most celebrated pieces, titled Rebirth, was purchased by a major museum. During the unveiling, Mark gave a speech about the journey that had led him to that moment. "Art has always been a way for me to process life," he said. "This piece, like many others, is a reflection of how we can grow from our struggles. It's about finding beauty in what once seemed broken." Emily watched proudly from the audience, Daisy lying at her feet. After the event, Mark and Emily returned home to celebrate quietly, cherishing the life they had built together. Claire's success at the shelter led to opportunities she never imagined. She was invited to consult on similar projects across the country, helping to establish community outreach programs and train staff. Her passion for animal welfare became her life's mission, and she threw herself into it wholeheartedly. One day, during a visit to a struggling shelter, Claire met a young volunteer named Megan. The girl's enthusiasm reminded Claire of herself when she first started. Over time, Claire mentored Megan, watching her grow into a confident advocate for animals. It was a source of pride and a reminder of how far she had come. Years later, Mark and Claire crossed paths again, this time in an unexpected setting. They were both invited to speak at a conference focused on community impact, Mark representing the arts and Claire championing animal welfare. Their names were listed back-to-back on the program, and when Mark stepped off the stage after his presentation, Claire was waiting in the wings. "That was beautiful," she said, smiling warmly. "You've always had a way with words." Mark chuckled. Coming from someone who's inspired countless people, that means a lot. Their conversation was easy, free from the weight of their past. They spoke about their work, the people they had helped, and the lessons they continued to learn. For a moment, it felt like no time had passed, even as they marveled at how much had changed. As Mark and Emily celebrated another anniversary, they decided to take a leap they had long discussed, starting a family. The decision came with excitement and a touch of nervousness, but they were ready to embrace the next chapter together. Emily's nonprofit was thriving, and Mark's art had secured a legacy that would endure beyond his lifetime. They found themselves dreaming of a life filled with love and laughter, ready to share their journey with the next generation. Claire's work expanded internationally, as she began collaborating with global organizations to improve animal welfare standards. Her leadership inspired others, and her story was featured in a documentary about transformative journeys. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Claire sat in her quiet home, reflecting on the twists and turns her life had taken. Daisy, now older and grayer but still faithful, rested at her feet. Claire stroked the dog's fur, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the second chances that had shaped her life. Though their lives rarely intersected, Mark and Claire's individual choices continued to ripple outward, touching countless lives. Their shared history had been a crucible of growth, and the lessons they learned from one another had laid the foundation for the futures they had built. Mark's paintings hung in galleries and homes around the world, quietly inspiring others to see beauty in resilience. Claire's shelters saved thousands of animals and educated generations about compassion and responsibility. Both left legacies of healing and hope that would endure long after they were gone. One crisp winter evening, Mark stood in his studio, putting the finishing touches on a new painting. Across the state, Claire walked through a bustling shelter, greeting staff and animals alike. Though they hadn't spoken in years, they each carried a quiet awareness of the other's success and happiness. In their separate moments of reflection, they both smiled, grateful for the lives they had created. Their journeys had been anything but easy, yet they had found peace in their growth and purpose in their paths. And in the stillness of those moments, there was a sense of closure, not just for what had been, but for everything that lay ahead. Mark and Claire's journeys, though separate, left indelible marks on the world around them. As they moved further into the later stages of their lives, their stories became testaments to the power of resilience, growth, and the capacity to create meaningful change. Years later, Mark prepared for what would become his final and most ambitious project. It was a massive mural commission for a public space in his hometown, a tribute to the themes of healing and renewal that had defined his career. The mural depicted intertwining vines and blossoms growing from cracked soil, symbolizing life flourishing despite adversity. As the mural was unveiled, Mark stood before it, flanked by Emily and their 2 children. The crowd erupted in applause, and Mark felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. Later, during an interview, he reflected on his journey. "Every piece of art I've created has been a conversation with my past, my struggles, and my hopes for the future. This mural is a message to anyone who feels broken, that growth is always possible." Claire's influence extended far beyond the shelters she had managed. She founded an international organization dedicated to animal welfare, focusing on education, rescue, and rehabilitation. The organization became her legacy, with facilities in dozens of countries carrying forward her vision. At the opening of a new shelter in Africa, Claire delivered a heartfelt speech. "This isn't just about animals. It's about creating a kinder world for all of us. Every small act of compassion ripples outward, creating change we may never fully see." Surrounded by volunteers, supporters, and a new generation of advocates, Claire felt a deep sense of pride. Daisy's memory lived on in the organization's logo, a reminder of the dog who had changed her life. Though Mark and Claire had not spoken for many years, their stories continued to intersect in subtle ways. One day, Emily received a letter from Claire, inviting her and Mark to attend a gala celebrating the 20th anniversary of Claire's organization. Mark hesitated, but ultimately agreed. The event was a reunion of sorts, bringing together people whose lives had been touched by Claire's work. When Mark and Claire saw each other, the moment was quiet but warm. "I'm glad you came," Claire said. "You've done so much good, Mark." "So have you," he replied. "It's incredible to see how far you've come." They spent the evening reflecting on their journeys, marveling at how their shared past had shaped their futures. The mutual respect between them was palpable, a testament to the healing that had occurred over the years. As the years passed, Mark and Claire's work continued to inspire others. Mark's mural became a landmark, a place where people came to reflect, heal, and find hope. Claire's organization expanded its reach, fostering compassion and understanding in communities worldwide. When Mark passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 83, the art world mourned the loss of a visionary. His family ensured that his legacy lived on, organizing retrospectives and establishing scholarships for young artists. Claire attended one of these retrospectives, standing quietly before Rebirth, the painting that had once defined Mark's journey. She smiled softly, feeling gratitude for the role they had played in each other's lives. Years later, Claire herself passed away, leaving behind a global network of shelters and advocates who carried forward her mission. Her organization honored her with a memorial garden, a place of serenity where animals and humans could coexist peacefully. In the quiet echoes of their lives, Mark and Claire's stories became intertwined in the memories of those they had touched. Their legacies, though separate, were united by a common thread, the belief that brokenness could lead to beauty and that healing was always within reach. In the end, their journeys were not about perfection or resolution, but about the courage to keep moving forward. And in that, they found their ultimate peace.